Welcome to Underline This podcast, the podcast where we unpack the big ideas hiding in the margins. Because the best parts, they're between the lines. You're probably familiar with this book. It's one that I feel like everyone is forced to read when they're in middle school or in college, and that is Lord of the Flies by William Golding. It's probably one of the best podcasts that we've done yet. This is a book that is very, very well known. It's also one of my favorite Simpson episodes. So today we're going to break down this book by providing you with a summary. We'll talk about the author. We'll talk about the story itself, key themes, symbolism, as well as takeaways. Lord of the Flies was published in 1954 as an allegorical novel about a group of British schoolboys stranded on an island from a plane crash. I don't know how everyone only boys survived. I don't know the why. We just know that they are crashed on an island by themselves. And at first, they try to govern themselves. They assign responsibilities, they establish order, they have a democratic process for choosing who their leader is, which ends up being Ralph. And what happens eventually is that Jack, another boy who wants to be chief, he wants to start his own tribe, which is focused on hunting and power. And then eventually there becomes two different factions, Ralph, which represents democratic order, and then you have Jack, which is more of an authoritarian. Now, the boys' society collapses into savagery because of this conflict. And there's a fear of a mythical beast which drives them to make violent rituals, and they even murder one of the boys named Simon, who's like a Christ-like figure during a frenzy. And there's another character named Piggy, not his real name, just a nickname, who represents intellect and reason, and he's killed. And by the end of our story, Ralph is being hunted by Jack's tribe, but the last minute is saved by a naval officer. And ironically, this highlights how civilization itself is embroiled in war. So there's a summary of the story. Let's talk about William Golding, our author. Golding was born in 1911 and passed away in 1993. He was a British novelist, poet, and school teacher. Now, something that's kind of odd to think about is I wonder what he was thinking of while he was teaching his students. I wonder if this story was just like an idea that came to his mind where he thought, what would happen if you all got stranded on an island? I don't know if that's more of a reflection on Golding or maybe just some really troublesome students. Who knows? Just thought it was a little funny thing to bring up. Now, Golding served in the Royal Navy during World War II, where he witnessed the horrors of conflict. He was a witness to the D-Day landings, which is one of the most bloody battles in history. And it was his experiences in war which influenced his view of human nature, that it is inherently flawed. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in Literature in 1983 for his works exploring the dark side of humanity. And before Lord of the Flies, he'd been rejected more than 20 times by publishers. Have you ever thought about that? Or have you ever heard that quote? Get knocked down 7 times, get up 8. Kind of applies here. Don't get published 20 times, get published the 21st time. So that's another inspirational example that just keep on pursuing and you'll get that desired outcome. All right, now let's talk about themes from the book itself. First, you got civilization versus savagery. It's interesting that once the boys crash and they land on the island, they begin to try and recreate the old world, the world that they come from, which is a world of order, democracy, and shared collaboration. And it's in this state that Ralph is elected as the chief, and the group appoints hunters. They give responsibilities out to some of the other boys who will be in charge of keeping a fire to keep smoke up in case a plane flies over, there's a ship that's looking for them. And then on the flip side, there's savagery, which is represented by Jack. So just to think about this, civilization would be Ralph, the current chief. And then you got Jack, who's the authoritarian, that is the tyrannical leader that drives everything into chaos. And man, there's so much here that is relatable to the real world when you have civilization and order, but then very quickly it gets overtaken and corrupted by a authoritarian figure or tyrannical leader. For example, look at Venezuela, one of the most wealthy, or one of the countries that has one of the largest oil reserves that it's sitting on, and yet it is in complete turmoil. It was also at one point one of the most educated countries in the world, and today it's a narco state. So it just shows that this idea of civilization versus savagery, or even democracy and order being overtaken by corruption, can happen and will happen if certain safeguards aren't in place. And next, we got loss of innocence. Now, the boy's descent mirrors humanity's innate capacity for brutality. And this story, as I was reading about this and seeing how you have innocent young boys quickly turn into murderers and lose humanity, sadly, it reminded me of the real world when you might see child soldiers, children who are used as pawns in a war. And it breaks my heart because these are children who are being placed, and again, I'm referring to the story and in real life to child soldiers or people in similar situations where you have children that are being placed into adult situations where they don't have the maturity nor the developed brain to really process what's going on. And sadly, at that young of an age, your mind is very moldable, malleable. And in these circumstances, it really warps the child's view of the world. And that's something unfortunate that happens here. And next, you got the nature of evil. Golding suggests evil is not external, but within humans themselves. I really feel like that saying that is just reframing the same question, which is evil something that is within all of us, that if tapped into, it manifests itself? Or is evil something that is thrust upon us in the right circumstances or in unique circumstances? And when I think about this, I'm reminded of the Stanford prison experiment, where you had a case study where you had students that volunteered. Half of them were assigned as police officers, the other half were assigned as prisoners, and each group was given uniforms, they were given responsibilities, and unfortunately, during this case study, what they were trying to do is they were trying to identify in what circumstances can average, normal, everyday citizens commit atrocities. And going off of memory here, some of that includes when unregulated authority is given, when dehumanization occurs, and another one I wanted to bring up is when there are when certain behavior is condoned by higher authority. So, for example, in the Stanford prison experiment, you had uniforms that were given to the police officers. They had aviators, they had hats, they had badges. They looked like the part. And then you had the prisoners who were given swimming caps to represent their heads being shaved. They were given shackles, they had prison jumpsuits, and they're barefoot. So they looked the part of a prisoner. And then you also had very unclear guidelines that were given. Again, that was by design to the police officers, so that when they were supposed to control their behavior, or even just like run this imaginative prison, they began to do horrible things, like they began to abuse the prisoners, they began to take away food, they began to lock them, they began to separate people and put them into solitary confinement. And the experiment itself lasted, I believe, 2 weeks. And it was supposed to go for much longer, but it was stopped because one of the participants went to the professor that was running this experiment and just courageously said, "This isn't right. You need to stop what you're doing." And that is actually the cure to this savagery that manifests, and this evil is that despite these conditions, it's rising above those and just recognizing if something's wrong, address it. My wife loves to quote what you see at the airport, which is, if you see something, say something, be brave, and stop it. And so that's kind of what, I mean, that is what happens here in the book, where you've got nature. I mean, again, I don't know. I think the question of itself is just reframing it in a different way, but it's asking the same thing, which is that whether evil is external or internal, I mean, the result is the same at the end. Next, we got power and leadership. Now, earlier I mentioned that we have two leadership styles. We've got Ralph, who's the democratic, collaborative, orderly leader, and then you've got Jack, who's the authoritarian. It's very interesting to see how power shapes this society and also our society as well. In Ralph's case, because they're taking the democratic collaborative approach, you've got different responsibilities. You've got different individuals who are responsible for hunting, for building shelter, for keeping a fire going so that they can, so if there's a rescue boat or plane that happens to be passing by, they can see that. So it's a very productive society versus Jack's, which is more authoritarian. Jack uses a bait and switch technique by promising that if you join his tribe, that there will be fun and hunting. But really what ends up happening is Jack and his tribe use their power to steal from the democratic and orderly one. And it really becomes a hierarchy within that tribe, where those that wield the most power are the ones that steal from those at the bottom. And really, those at the bottom are just pawns for serving those at the top. Which, again, just as I'm saying this, think about how real that is in the real world. I used the example of Venezuela in the past, or I guess earlier in the podcast, I used Venezuela as an example where you had what was a very educated and potentially a society that should have been able to have a lot of resources to manage itself, quickly fall apart because of an authoritarian that gave false promises and got to the top and broke the established order. Next, we have fear. Now, the imagined beast symbolizes irrational fear that leads to violence. In a lot of podcasts, even on this one before, I don't remember if I said it already, but Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme. And this is one of those rhymes that you see throughout history, is that fear is a prerequisite to violence. Just to bring a historical example off the top of my head. For example, if you've seen the Netflix series American Primeval, at the very beginning in the first episode, they show the Mountain Meadows Massacre. Quick recap of what that is. Again, I'm a history major, so I do have an authority to talk about this to some extent. But the Mountain Meadows Massacre occurred as a result of the Utah Territory, which was the Mormon settlers. They were at a heightened conflict with the United States, and you had a group of settlers that were trying to pass from Arkansas through the Utah Territory to the West Coast. And when they were passing through, they were seen as being enemies, as being outsiders with malicious intent. And what ended up happening is that those that were living in the territory, when they came across them, encountered them, they ended up massacring them. And that was due to fear, because they were at a heightened sense that there was going to be this inevitable conflict, and they thought that these individuals weren't necessarily passing through, but there to try and do harm to them. And again, this is one of those rhymes that you see throughout history, which is that fear is a prerequisite to violence. And that's what happens in the book. It's because of fear of this beast that the children begin to do odd things. Like, for example, when they kill a pig, they take its head, they put it on a pike as almost like an offering to appease this beast. And then they act out violence, they do rituals, they dance, and it's all out of fear that they're doing these things. It's almost kind of like, it's kind of an odd example, but I'll use it anyway. But think about when people do things like they might have like a lucky charm, or they have rituals that they do to try and give themselves a sense of control of their fear. So for example, if you're go back to the lucky charm example. Let's say I'm going to go play some baseball, and every game that I've won has I noticed that it's because I don't wash my socks. I don't wash them. They get stinky. Maybe that is a strategy. But anyway, sticking to the point. With the lucky charm mindset, you do things or you act in a certain way because you think it's going to impact the outcome, when really there's probably other things that you can control, right? But it's out of fear, or even just giving ourselves a sense of control, that we do these things. So that's why they do this, is because they're acting out of fear. They're doing things that don't necessarily make sense, but they believe that it will help them have control of the situation and have control over their fear. All right, let's talk about symbolism. First, let's talk about the conch shell. The conch shell represents law, order, and democratic authority. In the book, Ralph and the others, when he blows the conch shell, what it does is it's essentially a calling to assemble. It's also whoever holds the conch shell is the one that is able to talk and give their piece and give their opinion. And so I think that is a very interesting symbol. Next, you got Piggy's glasses. So Piggy, again, that's not his real name, but he's the character that represents reason, intellect. And what they end up doing is they use his glasses actually to start a fire. So the glasses, again, represent that intellect and that logic. And inevitably what happens is when savagery and chaos is introduced, Piggy's glasses Piggy is actually murdered. Next, we got the beast. Now, this represents inner savagery and fear projected outward. They've got fear of something that's going to happen, but really that fear is directed to, let me take a step back here. The thing that they all should fear the most is the savagery that manifests itself in these children. And that is what the beast represents. Next, we got the Lord of the Flies, or the pig's head on a stick. That's a manifestation of evil and the darkness of man's heart. In my mind, it represents corruption, right? I mean, it just even to create that Lord of the Flies, you had to kill something, you had to take its head and put it on a stick, and then it rots, it attracts flies and insects, and it's just a gruesome picture. And I think that's a good way to think about how the darkness of man's heart comes about, is that something unnatural, something that is inhuman occurs, and it just attracts the worst things. Next, we got the fire. The fire represents hope for rescue, but also represents destruction when misused. So fire is what ends up being used to destroy parts of the island, but it also is what they were used when it's controlled in order to create a signal to rescue boats and planes. Then last symbol that I'll mention here is that you got Simon, who is a Christ-like figure who understands the true nature of the beast, but is killed before he can reveal it. I'm going to give you some interesting facts. The title of this book, Lord of the Flies, comes from a literal translation of Beelzebub, which is a biblical name for the devil. That is terrifying. So it's when the children create the Lord of the Flies, they call him that. That is essentially them turning towards a darkness, which again, in Christianity, the ultimate darkness is Satan, who's also known as Beelzebub. Now, another interesting fact about this book is that early reviewers criticized it as being too bleak. And it really wasn't popular until it was adopted as required reading in schools, which is hilarious because that's why I read it. And Golding said the novel was partly a response to R.M. Ballantyne's The Coral Island, 1858, which is a Victorian adventure where boys remain civil and good on an island. And Golding wanted to show the opposite of that. Now, there actually were two major films that were created. I've never seen them, but there's the 1963 version and a 1990 version. And it's referenced in countless works of pop culture, referring to Lord of the Flies. In 2020, there actually was a real life case, kind of like Lord of the Flies, that emerged where Tongan schoolboys were stranded on an island for over a year in 1965. But luckily, unlike Golding's novel, they cooperated peacefully and they survived together. Now for my takeaways. I like to think of books that are really thought provoking as having a lot of protein. This is a book where if you do take the time to really think about what's going on and ask questions, which I think is one of the most important things when you're reading a book, is to ask questions. Like, for example, oh, well, what could the conch shell mean? Why is Piggy the way he is? What does this scene mean? Just by asking those basic questions, you're able to ascertain quite a bit. And you can, sometimes when I can't sleep at night, when I read, and then if I am trying to fall asleep, I'll try and ask these questions and then take that time to really process and digest what it was that I read, or maybe there's deeper meaning. Because there's a lot of books that have what a lot of critics call iceberg theory, which is an example that I've given in the past is Ernest Hemingway's writing, which is that you're writing a story such as an old man that goes fishing, but it's really not just about an old man who goes fishing. It's a story of the human spirit and perseverance. That's how a lot of novels are written, is that on the surface, yeah, this is a story about children that are trying to survive and end up trying to kill each other in the end before they're rescued. But there's a lot more deeper meaning than just that. There's themes of civilization versus savagery, loss of innocence, the nature of evil, power and leadership, and fear. This book is definitely filled with a lot of protein for you to digest, and I highly recommend it. It's short. I actually read it in, I think, 2 days. I started it yesterday and finished it earlier this morning. And so this is all fresh from my mind. And I would recommend maybe taking your time, not doing what I did. One of the benefits of doing a podcast like this is it does force me to take the time to digest and communicate what I've put together, what I've read, and communicate in a way that's digestible. So that's our pod for the day. Thank you very much for listening to this analysis and review and solo book club discussion on Lord of the Flies. Please give the Underline This podcast a follow on Instagram and subscribe to our channel on YouTube. Thanks again, everyone.